All right, let's fill in some note sheets. So my Roman numeral 2 is, obviously we're not in chronological order. I'm going to kind of bounce around by subject here, but you've heard a lot of the information that you now need to fill in. The Pilgrim's internal motivation and self-government will bring positive external consequences. So we're not condemning the Jamestown colony. There's so much good that comes there, as we've talked about with Edwin Sands and others, but I do want you to see a difference in how the internal character, the internal self-government of the Pilgrims is going to bring a different result up in Plymouth. So again, we look back to James 1:22 through 25 that exhorts us to be doers of the word and not hearers only, deceiving our own selves. But whoever looks into the perfect law of liberty and continues in it, being not a forgetful hearer, but a doer of the word, this man shall be blessed in his deed. And we will see that despite sufferings and despite possible temptations to not live according to the word, that these pilgrims were so devoted to the word of God and to living their lives by its precepts that they will be faithful in walking out the perfect law of liberty, and they are blessed. And not only are they blessed, but their posterity is blessed, and we are blessed. They truly did become stepping stones for the gospel and for what would become American liberty. All right, the Pilgrims come, their motivation, guys, is simply so that they and their families could walk with God as God revealed it in His Word. So that they and their families could walk with God as God revealed it in His Word. Part of that, as we saw clearly in Bradford's writing, is that they desired to save their posterity, to keep them from dissolute ways, from corruption, and that they sought to propagate the gospel. So if you want to put that in parentheses, the propagation of the gospel, again, that same term, and we see it in Bradford's writing. They believed that freedom of worship for themselves and their descendants was worth any price. It was worth dying for. They recognized that there would be sacrifice, the ultimate sacrifice. I don't think anybody understood that it was going to be a 50% death rate in the first winter. But still they came. These were students of the Geneva Bible. The Geneva Bible is what they brought with them. At the Pilgrim Hall Museum in Plymouth, they actually have William Bradford's. They have William Bradford's Geneva Bible. It's fascinating. They have John Alden. John Alden was one of the first comers. They have John Alden's Bible. Anyway, fascinating stuff to see. But the Geneva Bible is teaching them how to apply the principles of the Bible, remember, not just to church life, not just to their own personal character, but to all of life, including civil government, how they are to operate. So it should not surprise us, because they've studied the Geneva Bible, they've read those commentaries that came out of Geneva. Calvin influenced, Luther influenced, John Knox influenced. So they are thinking, they understand creator-redeemer distinction. They understand the proper role of the civil government, the limited role of the civil government, etc. And so we're going to see something different that forms there in Plymouth. They would have had, as I mentioned, to submit themselves to the London Company's governance, but God caused them to be blown off course and land in the Plymouth Group's jurisdiction. However, before leaving the Mayflower, they will sign the Mayflower Compact. And you all wrote, you did a little homework on what made this such a special document. And if it were in class, I'd quiz you, right, and ask you, what did you say? But hopefully you all said that this was a mutual covenant. This was people, again, voluntarily consenting to come together and to form a government, a civil government. So they're leaving behind some of their liberties, their individual liberties, because they have to submit themselves to one another. And they're going to have representation. They're going to have representative government that they all agree to with a constitution. So this is huge. And I put it in big capital letters because this is the first time that free men have ever written their own constitution and agreed to self-govern. It's not coming from some outside authority or a king. This is coming from the people themselves. It was written as, oh, here it is. So, in the name of God, amen. So we start off right there with a dedication to God. In the name of God, amen. We whose names are underwritten. Guys, that's huge. It's not written by a king. The we here refers actually to the people whose names are going to be signed. We whose names are underwritten. The loyal subjects of King James, I won't read all his titles. Having undertaken for the glory of God and advancement of the Christian faith and the honor of our king and country. So glory of God, advancement of the Christian faith, honor of king and country. We've undertaken a voyage to plant the first colony up in the northern parts of Virginia. We do by these presents solemnly and mutually, okay? So we're serious about this, and mutually, together, mutually, gosh, I can't give another explanation, but and then in the presence of God. This is a covenant. It involves this third party, God. So in the presence of God and one another, we covenant and combine ourselves together into a civil body politic. So they're not just a church, they are setting out how they will be governed in the civil realm. They see it as different, and it is different. They go on to say, for our better ordering and the preservation and furtherance of all the ends that have been laid out, and by virtue hereof we will enact, constitute, and frame such just and equal laws, ordinances, etc., as shall be thought most meet and convenient for the general good of the colony, unto which we, again, all these undersigned, we promise due submission and obedience. So we are going to draft laws, ordinances, and constitutions and acts and things like that from time to time, and we promise, mutually we agree, we voluntarily agree that we will submit to those laws with obedience. And then they sign their name. So the Mayflower Compact was written as a covenant with God, because all the men are required to sign, or all the men, are given the opportunity to sign. All men are equal in the sight of God. It was the strangers, they came into covenant with the strangers, not just the pilgrims signed. You do need to know it was only the men who signed. Why is that? Because they believed in the covenantal head, and that a family was a covenant as well, and that the father was the representative. So he represented the whole family when he signed his name. It wasn't that, okay, well, the women and children aren't bound to this agreement. No, it's interposition, it's representation, and they got it, and they got it right. It affirms that the people would govern themselves. I put, wow, first time ever. This is huge. This is huge, and these are going to be these seeds that are planted in America that are going to give birth to a country like no other. It said the leaders would be accountable to the people, and it established that the people would voluntarily agree to be governed. All right, this is an image this is actually Plymouth Plantation as it exists today. They've recreated what it would have looked like, right down to, we know exactly who lived on which piece of property because William Bradford recorded all that for us in Plymouth Plantation. So they literally know what size, they know about the house. So down to the nearest detail, they have recreated what Plymouth Plantation would have looked like in the, probably 1630s or something. They landed in 1620. This is the bay right here. And right down here, this house that kind of stretches over, this would have been called the Common House. This was the first place that they built. And when everybody was so sick that first winter, they were either on board the ship or they were being housed here in the Common House during that terrible first winter. This is the actual street in Plymouth. This is called Leyden Street. Leyden is where they came from in Holland, Delfshaven and Leyden. So this is called Leyden Street. And this is the actual land where Plymouth Plantation was planted, and there are houses still in each one of those spots. Of course, they aren't the original mud and stud homes that they first built. We can kind of complain, oh gosh, we don't have the original homes. No, you have things from the early 1700s. So everything's relative. Old is relative. So this is still a very old home, but it sits on the site of that common house where the sick were kept and where the first treaty with the Wampanoags under their sachem was signed. So this is where that 50-year treaty of peace was signed between the Pilgrims. Squanto would have walked here. Samoset would have walked here. Massasoit would have signed that treaty right here in this spot. Oh, John Howland, the teenage boy that got thrown overboard and was miraculously saved, his house is like literally kind of behind that bush. It's up the street about that far and across. And that's where John Howland's descendants lived for many, many, many years. All right, the Mayflower Compact is a remarkable, first of its kind instrument of civil government. Here's what's really cool, guys, because we've backed up in time to go through the history of the founding of these colonies. So remember, they come in 1620. We're 8 years before the Petition of Right. We're 20 years before the Civil War in England still. So, like Rutherford and Sidney, they're not writing yet. Locke is still a baby; he's not born, right? And so they're putting into effect all of the philosophies that you've written about and read about in Rutherford and Sidney and in Locke, but they're doing it 70 years before John Locke said, men form societies for the mutual preservation of their lives, liberties, and estates, or they're by nature free, equal, and independent, or that just governments are formed by consent. They're doing it 60 years before Sidney said the ground of all just governments is general consent. So because they're thinking the same thoughts, it's just that they're going to have an opportunity to plant those ideas in a new land and actually write a constitution based on it long before that opportunity comes to England. All right, the many providences of God. We've read about these, so we're just going to fill in the blanks. You do need to see this wonderful quote, because it's a testimony again to the Protestant and Reformed foundations of America. Murray Rothbard, who was a Harvard historian, said the world's most important experiment in government began, much like most great innovations, as a principled spiritual conviction. Thus was the American experiment founded on a Reformed theological covenant. I know many of you are ninth graders. These are deep thoughts. I want you to see that these weren't just good ideas that were planted in America. What Murray Rothbard is saying is they weren't just good ideas. They were God ideas. And they were specifically from a Reformed covenantal background. Okay, so the timing, the providences of God. First of all, the timing. The fact that the 80 Years' War was suspended just long enough for the Pilgrims to take refuge in Holland and prepare them for what was to come. Provision. Over and over again, we see God providing in Squanto, in having the screw, that right metal, big heavy metal screw on board to hold the leaking Mayflower together. God provides over and over again. Safety. The only death on the crossing was I was going to read you that account, was one mocking sailor. None of the Pilgrims died despite being very sick, but despite, having been thrown overboard. And yet, the only person that died was this this guy that made fun of the Pilgrims, talked about how he could hardly wait to stick him in a shroud and throw him overboard, and what a bunch of puking idiots you are, on and on and on and on and on. And in fact, he will be the first one, or the only one rather, to get sick and die, and his body is the one that's thrown over. The weather is another providence of God. The weather turned, and we know God controls the weather. And that weather, after weeks of trying to get to where they were supposed to be more southerly, they are forced to land north of the London Company's jurisdiction. Then direction, specific direction. They landed, amazingly, you guys, they land right at the site of that abandoned Indian village where they found buried food, where they were not going to be attacked immediately because everybody's kind of avoiding the area, like the plague, because there had been a plague there, and they thought maybe there were evil spirits, and so the local people stayed away, which allowed safety for our pilgrims. More providence, Samoset and Squanto. We have two local natives who speak English, who will assist the pilgrims and will have peace for 50 years. That first winter is when they experience terrible losses to their numbers. It's not until the spring that they meet Samoset and Squanto. They begin to learn to farm, and their first harvest comes in the fall. And so it's the fall, guys, of 1621 when we have that first Thanksgiving that's so celebrated and so written about. Elder Brewster will preach for 3.5 hours at that Thanksgiving, and he reports that 9 Wampanoags are converted. Sorry, it's hard to read that 9, but it's not. 9 Wampanoags were converted that first Thanksgiving. So these guys are actually living out what they said they were coming to do, which was to advance the gospel of Christ. And they're going to be intentional about that in the years to come. The Pilgrims endure great hardship. Okay, before you fill in those blanks, I've got one of them wrong. Okay, so they endure, remember, a general sickness during that winter. And the only two people who really never got sick were Elder Brewster, and the other one should say Miles Standish. I put the wrong name in. So Elder Brewster and Miles Standish, who served the families selflessly. Now I want you to understand what kind of suffering they faced. These are families. These are not just hardy young men coming. We know what happened in Jamestown. These are families, but they arrive in Plymouth, Massachusetts in the dead of winter with ice, I mean, just unbearable, miserable conditions, very little supplies, and yet, really it's probably remarkable that as many survived as did. Let me show you. This is an illustration or visual aid representing all the families who came. Some of them are Pilgrim family. Most of the ones that have children are Pilgrim families. Then you have some single men who came. Some of them are servants that are attached to a family, for example. But these represent the, I think, 102 passengers that came on board the Mayflower. After the first winter, this is who survived. You can pause if you want to see. We went from this to this. Devastation. You see here, this young lady's whole family is wiped out. She's the only one left. This whole family, entire family, wiped out. This one, the father dies, leaving just a mother, a son, and a little infant child. I think that's the White family. In some cases, we have a widow. What you'll very quickly see is that the men who are left, like if there's a family like this that's left with no father, that they will marry, and they'll marry pretty quickly because they need to survive. She'll need protection, and so the widows will marry those widowers and become a new family. So 102 people come on the Mayflower. There were 24 families that came. After that first winter, 4 families were entirely wiped out. 16 families had lost at least one person, and only 4 families out of 24 came through that winter completely intact. But guys, that's not the end of the story. There's some amazing places in Plymouth. I encourage you one day, come with me. We'll go do the tour. But there's some amazing and very humbling and solemn places to visit in Plymouth, like where they buried those 51 people that first winter. They had to bury them right close to town. And they bury them at night. They didn't want the local peoples to see how their numbers were shrinking and to see how vulnerable they were. But God, out of that suffering, brought a miracle. Because of the 51, it should say 51 people who survived that first winter, there are 30 million descendants from 51 people. This is God's blessing on a people who said they were going to build their foundations on the rock of Christ, and they did. They said they wanted to be stepping stones, right? And they were. I just think it's so fitting and so providential that the symbol of Plymouth is Plymouth Rock. It's a rock. It's a stepping stone. It's exactly what they said they wanted to be. Now, William Bradford, at the end of his record of Plymouth Plantation, he wrote why he wrote all this stuff down. He was writing it to you guys. He was writing it to me. And he said this: "We've noted these things so that you might see their worth and not negligently lose what your fathers have obtained with so much hardship." We gained religious liberty. We gained civil liberty. We established a self-governing society. And guys, I'm telling you, he says, I'm telling you all these things because I want you to understand how much they're worth. I don't want you to negligently lose, like just throw your hands up and lose what your fathers obtained for you with so much hardship. That's where we are today, and that's our challenge today, is to stand firm and defend what the Pilgrims gained for us with the providence of God and with great suffering. Now I want you to look at this painting. I think that's where we are. Yes, this is the Embarkation of the Pilgrims. So real quickly, we'll go over this. This is another painting that was placed in the Capitol Rotunda in the 1840s, I believe. Let me flip to my sheet and make sure I've got my notes. Got it right for you. This is the very last sheet of your note packet. So yeah, installed in the Capitol in 1840. You have here a quote on the page from Governor Bradford. Thus out of small beginnings, greater things have grown by his hand, who made all things out of nothing, and gives being to all things that are. And as one small candle may light 1,000, so the light kindled here has shone to many, yea, in a sense to our whole nation. Let the glorious name of Jehovah have all the praise. The embarkation of the Pilgrims is showing you that scene that was described by Bradford when they are leaving Delfshaven, when they're leaving Leyden and Delfshaven and boarding the Speedwell. And so if you look down here on the deck of the ship, you'll see this is not the Mayflower. They're on board the Speedwell. And this scene of prayer and doleful tears, and the people here standing on the dock observing all of this. Some of your prominent characters. Well, number one, let's just talk about like where your eye is drawn. So the light seems to be shining over here, right? It looks much darker on this side of the painting than it does over here. So this light is shining down over here on this woman in prayer and on this young person, this little boy. And do you notice that these are families? That we have husbands and wives, children prominently featured throughout, because the artist is communicating something to you. He's saying, we're committing this to prayer. These are families that are going to plant themselves in the New World. And then probably the most prominent, the white paint in this painting, our eye is drawn right here. And this is actually Elder Brewster, and he is holding the Geneva Bible. This is John Carver. This man he's the first governor. So he goes, John Carver, his servant was John Howland, who went overboard. This is their pastor, John Robinson, who had faithfully served them in England and come with them and served all this time in Holland, but he will stay behind with the other 400 who aren't going. This is John Robinson with his arms extended in prayer. This is John Carver, first governor. And behind him, symbolically, because he will take his place, this is William Bradford, the one that was just a lad, right? Just a lad in England. He's grown, I think he is 30 years old. Something like 30 years old by the time they leave. Yeah, that would make sense. About 30 years old. And John Robinson. And then this is his mentor, who's probably about 50 years old, Elder Brewster. So William Bradford, the lad, and Elder Brewster, the man who owned that Scrooby Manor house, and now will go as the spiritual leader of the colony in 1620. Here on the deck, you guys are some of the instruments of war. So we see armor here, we see a rifle, or not a rifle, but a musket. And this man is Miles Standish, and he has his armor on. This is his wife, Rose Standish. And Miles and Rose Standish, or Miles Standish, is here, and he's very colorful. And this is another important point, actually, that the Pilgrims did not wear black and white. So we see a lot of black and white here, but they actually wore very colorful clothes. And Miles Standish is pictured here. He's going to be the warrior. He's supposed to go in defense of the colony. So we recognize that they know they're sailing into danger, and they're prepared for that. What you also see here, this long thing here, it's kind of hidden behind the helmet, that's that iron screw that would be used to later secure the mast. So how interesting that the painter, Robert Weir, thinks that it's important enough, this providence of God, that he wants to include it. He recognizes that without that, this voyage would not have made it. So he's giving special attention to that great iron screw. Over here, you'll notice too that there's kind of a division between what's dark on the right and what's light on the left. And prominently featured, you probably already noticed, is a rainbow. This is a rainbow of promise. And this young person, he's the next generation. And he is looking out here across the Atlantic to the future, right? He's looking to what's to come, to the promise of brighter days ahead. Now, even though there's a rainbow, these aren't blue skies, right? These are stormy skies. So again, a recognition that the Pilgrims are going to have faith to make it through very stormy days, but that there's the promise of God's faithfulness and of success in the future as they walk according to His Word. One more little cool detail about this painting. If you look up in the sail, in very faint letters, you can see it spells out essentially the English term for Emmanuel, God with us. God with us is written up in the sail. of the speedwell. All right, guys, that's all I have for you for this video session. So that should wrap up your note sheets, and you just have the rest of your homework to work on, and then I will see you in October.